hello to Nijay over in the People's Republic of Portland, where the revolution continues. Long live the revolution. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well, Mike. How are you?
Well, life is good down here in Melbourne Grad, where the Vegemite is fresh and the kangaroo roams free. We're not doing well. This week, we're together again, this time looking at Romans. And we're looking at a particular part of Romans, chapters 12 to 15. I feel like this is the real neglected part of Romans because everyone likes chapters 1 to 4 because that's, your justification by faith stuff. Then you get chapters 5 to 8, which includes, in Adam and union with Christ and who the heck is the guy or who's the wretched man. And we could do a whole episode on that one. And then you got chapter 8, big themes of assurance, the Spirit, nothing can separate us from the love of God. Then we have chapter 9 for the Calvinists. Chapter 10, a little bit more of a Reformation drop-in about justification by faith. Chapter 11, we've got some stuff about an olive tree, which is a big deal in Jewish-Christian relations, and a little bit of end times theology if you want to swing that way as well. Then you get like the first two verses of chapter 12. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, offer yourselves as living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. And do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you'll be able to test and approve what God's will is, God's pleasing and perfect will. And then pretty much everyone sticks in the bookmark and then moves on to something else. Maybe Jeremiah, maybe Luke, but people after about verse 2 of chapter 12, people pretty much check out of Romans. And it's kind of like the closing credits is really what happens. But what is some of the good stuff we have in this section of Romans, Nijay? Well, if we stop reading it at chapter 12, verse 2, what would we be missing?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So, a good way to, I think, approach the kind of argument you're making that this gets neglected is, I like to point to Scot McKnight's newish book, Reading Romans Backwards, because he makes the argument that you just say, where you kind of run out of steam after all this exciting stuff. My favorite part of Romans, one of my favorite parts of Romans, is Romans 5 through 8. There's just so much kind of core theological stuff about cruciformity and participation in Christ. And then so many interesting things in Romans 9 through 11. And you kind of run out of energy. If you're teaching a course or doing a Bible study, you probably spend all your time in those early chapters. You hardly get to this stuff. And if you remember, there are scholars who have said throughout the years, Paul's letters are split into theology in the first part of his letter and then ethics in the second part. And sometimes ethics can seem boring or maybe obvious. And so you kind of ignore that. What I like about Scott's book is he says those later chapters are kind of a gold mine for historians, because it helps you understand what's actually going on. It reminds you that Paul's letters, by and large, are responsive, occasional, situational. And, you and I, we fancy ourselves historians. There's so much in there that actually tell us what's going on the ground in that church. So, a few years ago, I think, did you write for that Romans in Context book, the Zondervan one?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I wrote mine on Romans 14 and 15 because I just am fascinated by the interplay of house church communities in Rome. And when you think about why Paul wrote Romans, I think often we think about theological reasons. He had to talk about his gospel, he had to talk about righteousness.
Yep.
But if we're thinking practically, he actually wants to talk about what's going on the ground in terms of disunity, one-upsmanship, people outdoing one another to take away honor. And Paul's trying to say, no, we have to come together. So when we try to reconstruct the situation in Romans, a lot of the information we need is right there in those chapters. So I actually think that it plays a role as a kind of a climax to the letter rather than kind of downhill closing credits kind of thing. So you get stuff about the church unified, you get stuff about love. Many people have compared Romans and Galatians. Romans, this big text, Galatians, this kind of precursor text. There are some really neat parallels there, just as Galatians climaxes with the law of Christ and the command to love. So Romans climaxes in that way as well. So there's a ton in here. If I were teaching a course on Romans, I would want to make sure that there was a lot of space in that course for those later chapters.
Yeah,
Um,
what I do as a teacher is we do the exegesis from the first, 8 chapters or whatever, but I make sure I set all the essays on the second half of Romans. So we'll do the exegesis on the first half, but to make sure the second half doesn't get neglected, we don't have the time, often have the time to cover it in class. So I'll make all the assessment or the essays about either 9-11 or 12 to 16. And so that's how I try to cover it as an instructor. Yeah.
so do you have them buy my $150 dissertation since it's on worship language and Paul?
No, but I think we either have the book or we have the ebook. And I do refer to your work and also to Sarah Whittle, her work as well, about the theme of worship. But I mean, while you're here, Nijay, I know this is stuff that's near and dear to your heart, and you've got some strong feelings on the what is it, the latreia that Paul talks about, and maybe you can tell us what is our logical or spiritual act of worship. That's I think that's the big question, because that's the thing that students are. What's our logical or spiritual or reasonable act of worship?
Yeah, well, I got the title of my dissertation from Gordon Fee, who translate that as worship that makes sense to Paul. And some people want to make connections to Stoicism or some kind of philosophy. I think we're probably working too hard to get to those kinds of conclusions. I think what Paul is trying to do is reframe how they think of worship. So if you take, I'm working on a book right now for Brazos on comparing early Christianity to Greco-Roman religion. And so I've been thinking a lot about what religion looked like for regular Greeks and Romans, non-Jews, non-Christians. And you take an average worshiper in the Roman world, and their duty was to respect the gods. And respecting the gods meant performing the rituals in a certain way on time and showing kind of polite respect for the kind of higher ups. And here Paul, and that means giving a proper sacrifice, giving your money. Here Paul is saying, offer your soma, your bodies, as living sacrifice. This would have been a contradiction in terms. A sacrifice is dead, and you're offering your bodies as living sacrifices. Paul is going deeper and bigger and more holistic in what God wants from us than just observing, what Romans call the pax deorum, making peace with the gods.
Yeah.
He's saying, you become the sacrifice. You become the thing that you give to God, not just a token, not just an expression, not just a first fruit, but you're the sacrifice. And I'll say something, and I have a question for you. Romans 12 plays an important role in bookending, not exactly bookending, but bookending Romans, because worship is talked about in chapter 1. We sometimes miss that. Paul talks about himself as a worshiper, latruo, in chapter 1. He brings worship, I think 1 verse 7. But then in that famous passage, chapter 1 verses 18 to 32, he's talking about misshapen worship, distorting worship. You see the image of how sin has corrupted worship, has corrupted our orientation towards God. And then finally, all these chapters later in 12, you see a recovery of that. Therefore, in view of God's mercy and the way he's redeemed and set us on a healthier path, we can now untwist that worship to become proper worshipers. But I have a question for you about this, Mike, because I think you and I probably disagree on this. There's a debate about whether soma, body, means the physical body or whether it means the whole person. And in my dissertation, I spent a lot of time arguing that he's talking about the physical body, not to the exclusion of the mind, because he brings that in the next verse. But the reason I say the body is because he goes on to talk about food. He goes on to talk about how we live in community. And I don't want to take that away from what Paul's talking about, that he's talking about how we live embodied obedience to God. I can't remember what you say in your commentary, but do you address that?
Yeah, I don't remember what I say in my commentary. I remember Robert Jewett saying living sacrifices. He would paraphrase that as like bloodless sacrifice. I remember that bit. But I think I'm with you on the body. It means the physical body. We shouldn't project the sort of mind-body dualism or the mind-body debate back into that. And people often want to say, well, Paul means a soma, although he's writing Greek, he means it in a Hebraic sense, which is far more integrated and everything. No, I think body means, what you do with your body matters. What it matters in worship, it matters how you use it in your life before God and your life with other Christians. And although Paul does have, I think, a good theology of the mind, I mean, Craig Keener's got a good book on that, on Paul, Paul and the theology of the mind. I think, yeah, here you're right. He is referring to the physical body, and what you do with your body matters.
I think it's Boltmann who said, "You don't have a body. You don't have a soma. You are a soma." And then people, position that to say Paul's body language is about the person. But I think that worship discussion actually sets up the next few chapters, that we shouldn't view worship as just this restricted thing we do in a church or in a temple. Yeah. It's not just something that happens in cultic rituals, in special ceremonies. Worship is something that we do with our whole selves and our whole lives. And so in chapter 12, it's talking about the community of the church. In chapter 13, it's talking about the political life. In chapters 14 and 15, it's talking about life in community. And so I think Romans is sometimes viewed as a letter about righteousness or justification. I think we could actually say in some ways it's a letter about worship. It's a letter about life as worship.
Yeah, I'd probably add to that the theme of mission. I like what you say. People assume that the purpose of Romans is theological because Paul's got to deliver his kind of treatise or his theological manifesto. Otherwise, the Reformation will never happen, or something like that. Luke Timothy Johnson calls Romans basically a missionary fundraising letter, where he's trying to set forth his theological credentials and kind of help them out with maybe some disunity problems. I think, I mean, you could, well, actually, I would say I do agree with you on the worship thing. For me, the absolute climax of the letter has to be chapter 15, verses 7 to 9, which I think deals both with not just the theme of worship, but worshiping in unity. So chapter 15:7 says, accept one another just as Christ accepted you. Then note the purpose, in order to bring praise to God. For I tell you, Christ has become a servant of the Jews on behalf of God's truth to confirm the promises made to the patriarchs, so that the Gentiles may glorify God for his mercy. And then Paul proceeds with a series of Old Testament texts all about the Gentiles worshiping God. So I do think the worshiping side, the missional side, and the unity side all dovetail together. They all kind of come to point. So I think, worshiping as a united community, despite the differences of ethnicity, background, status within Roman society, that type of thing. I think Paul wants to see a united worshiping community, and where you have Jews and Gentiles worshiping God through the Messiah, and with the Spirit being manifested for Paul, and this is what I think Tom Wright would say, that is proof that the new creation has come, that a new world is beginning, and that Paul was actually doing a good job, of bringing Jews and Gentiles to worship the one God of Israel, bringing the Gentiles to the obedience of faith, and where they were welcoming one another. Yeah, so I definitely think worship is a key theme there.
I want to ask you, Mike. I always struggle with Romans chapter 13, and not so much the teaching of Paul on the governing authorities, but really why he talks about this.
Oh, yeah.
If you took that whole section out, I don't think we would miss it. It doesn't seem to us now as a necessary part of this letter if it's about worship or mission or righteousness or the relationship of Jews and Gentiles. I don't know if I had to write on this, how I would explain what brought this to Paul's mind as he is writing chapters 12 through 15. I kind of understand his argument that we need to show respect to governing authorities, but what does this have to do with anything he's talking about in this letter?
Yeah, that's a good. I mean, it's vexed many people. I think one of the church fathers, Origen, said this is one of the passages of Paul that bugged him the most, because in his day that this is. I mean, if you've got to wonder whether Paul would have written this if he knew he was going to had his head chopped off by Nero. It's like, dude, you realize that this is going to go south, and it's going to go south in a real bad way. Would he have written this if he knew about Nero, if he knew about Christendom, all that type of a thing? And as to why Paul has included it, there's a number of reasons. Some think it's just generally good advice. Don't don't um, don't bite the hand of good government. That's one thing. Others think that Paul is worried about an over-realized eschatology, like we're in the kingdom. Jesus is Lord, we reign, therefore we can ignore, kind of thing. We don't have we don't have to pay taxes because Jesus is our only king. That type of thing. An over-realized eschatology. I tend to think that Paul is writing at a time when there is a lot of anti-Roman sentiment brewing in Jewish communities, particularly in Judea, and you can hear the drums of war rolling. And after a series of incompetent or abrasive governors in Judea who have just exacerbated the situation, keep making it worse, I think he's worried this is going to go in a really bad direction. He doesn't want the Jewish Christians or the Gentile Christians in Rome imbibing some of that anti-Roman sentiment, particularly in the epicenter, of Rome. I mean, that's not really going to go down well. But at the same time, I don't think Paul is just saying, okay, be the grey man, keep your head down, have your own little religious club on the side, and just keep to your own and be a good citizen. One thing he does do, there is a slight subversive element here. He mentions God 6 times in this, 13, 1-7, and he mentions God as the one who appoints the government, the Roman imperial system, as his servant. Okay, so the whole Roman edifice is still subordinated to the God of Israel. And if you go all the way through to chapter 15, oh gosh, where is it? Verse 12, where he says, the root of Jesse will spring up, the one who will arise to rule over the nations. The Gentiles will hope in him. So he still does have a kind of a view of a kind of an eventual messianic overthrow of the Roman imperial system. So it's not quite all subservience, being purely passive before the empire. He does assert God's authority over Rome, and he does look forward to a day in the future when the Messiah, the root of Jesse, rules the nations. But yeah, it is something that does bug people. But maybe I find what more interesting is how this text gets interpreted in the history of tradition. During the English Reformation, what they did in some churches, they how they had all this ornate artwork, like with pictures of Mary and the saints. What they did in the English Reformation is they would completely paint it white, and they would replace it with Romans 13. So forget all that Catholic art. Obey the Protestant king. That's what we want you to do. None of this Mary and the saint stuff. Let's get all that artwork. Get rid of the artwork and just obey the king who's bringing some reformed faith to a parish near you. The other thing in the reception history that is interesting, maybe in a bad way, was when the former U.S. Attorney General Jeff Sessions famously quoted Romans 13, justifying what I think you would call, you could call it anything from their border policy of locking people up and children and separating families. He was justifying this. He was using this passage to justify this harsh deterrent, because if you cross a border, you're disobeying the government's wishes, and the government has authority to do bad things to you. And there's a whole bunch of religious organizations in America that were decrying this as a bad usage of Romans 13. So I find the reception history of it. I did read one good thesis on Romans 13. I cannot remember the dear woman's name, but I think it was written might have been under John Barclay or maybe Francis Watson at Durham, someone who wrote
Oh, was
there.
it Dorothea Birchman?
Yeah, that sounds about right. That sounds about right.
That's right. Yeah.
And my apologies for not remembering her name, but I thought that was an interesting thesis, and it kind of, was a good sort of update of a good summary of where discussions of Roman 13 have gone. One question I've got for you, for Nijay, moving along to chapters 14 and 15. Who are the weak and who are the strong?
Yeah. There are some really elaborate theories out there. I think Paul Manier was kind of a pioneer of some of these really elaborate theories. And so you kind of have a spectrum. On the one hand, some people have tried to use this discussion, especially Romans 14 and 15, to reconstruct house churches that fit along certain lines. You might have two, you might have four, you might have more. So you have the weak and the strong. These seem to relate to, strong in faith or weak in faith, certain Christian perspectives and practices. So, for example, the strong might be people who don't kind of follow some of the rituals of Judaism related to food practices or holidays. And then you have the weak who invest a lot in these practices. And what's interesting is Paul all along is trying to say, let's not take sides. And yet he himself is on one side. Which I think is really interesting. There's another theory out there that the weak are non-Christian Jews. I think perhaps Mark Nanos is one
Yeah.
of the people behind that. I don't really. I've reviewed some of Mark Nanos's work, and he's raised a lot of. I think what his work does for the Academy is it questions assumptions that we make as biblical scholars. I think that's the best use of his work. I don't feel like he's gained enough traction with, really concrete material to support his argument that Christians and Jews were in close fellowship and community in that time period. In fact, I think Francis Watson has argued pretty well the opposite of that. But what we can imagine in our mind's eye is in Rome, there were these micro communities that had different orientations towards the law and maybe some different practices. And I think partly behind Romans is that there's friction between these groups sometimes. And maybe with a letter coming from Paul, they were hoping that Paul was going to come down hard on one side and kind of say, he's put all his eggs in one basket. And Paul doesn't do that. His letter seems to be all about showing respect towards people that disagree on some of these issues. And one of the strange things he does, Mike, compared to Greco-Roman religion, is he invests a lot in conscience. And that
Yeah.
didn't really play a factor at all in Greco-Roman religion. You didn't care what conscience said. You only cared what the historical ritual practices were. And Paul's saying, let each person be made up in their own mind, whether to celebrate this holiday, whether to eat this particular kind of food. So Paul, I think, would have upset pretty much everybody in Rome by his not taking sides on this, right? What's your take on these passages?
Yeah, I mean, people often say, well, the weak are the Jewish Christians who are still keeping the law, and they're very sensitive about pork and the Sabbath, and the strong are obviously the Gentiles because they've come to faith and they don't have that Jewish baggage, so they're just happy to have Jesus in one hand and their pork sandwich in the other, and they don't know what the Jews' problem is, that type of thing. The problem is you can have some Gentiles who might be very conservative about idolatry and paganism because that's what they've come out of, and they're kind of reacting against that. I'm thinking and the issue is, how do you stop Gentiles from being Gentile? How do you take the pagan out of the pagans? And I think a lot of Jewish Christians would say, the law is how you do that, and maybe some Gentile Christians agreed with them. The problem is Paul, who is, people forget, is a Jewish Christian. Paul identifies with the strong. And that kind of just breaks it down. So I can imagine some very, very conservative or sensitive Gentile Christians, and they're sensitive because they've experienced idolatry and paganism. But then you could also have some more maybe libertine is the wrong word, but a little bit more lax or laid back Jewish Christians who are a little bit more flexible about how they live out their faith in the Greco-Roman world. So I don't think it breaks down neatly into ethnic groups or anything like that. I do think that there are probably different house churches that might have their own distinct practice of maybe they agree, okay, we'll make things kosher to respect our Jewish brothers and sisters. Other places, okay, fine, Jewish people, you just bring your own food. Okay, you just bring your own food and you do that. Or other places, it's like, prawns and pork sandwiches for everyone or something like that. So, and I think Paul is concerned with the unity of those groups. But what I did find interesting is that the language of being weak in faith doesn't entail a kind of deficiency. It's not meant to mean that there's something inherently wrong or broken. It just means someone whose conscience is more easily offended, okay, over a certain matter. And this is where I compare with my American friends, but particularly some of my Baptist friends. I'm always picking on the Baptists, who themselves can be very, very sensitive to issues of alcohol, okay, for a whole bunch of cultural and historical reasons, where I'm kind of, I don't mind a bit of a glass of wine with my pastor in the evening. So I'm like, what, you guys have your Shirley Temple. I'll be having my, Pinot Noir type of thing. But then the thing that weirded me out about American Baptists is they all celebrate their Halloween parties. And I've always regarded as Halloween as rather macabre and kind of, a bit sort of into sort of dark supernatural themes, and I'm thinking this is like all witchcraft, man, ain't it? We don't celebrate Halloween. Most Christians in Australia don't celebrate Halloween. And so it's funny when I see my Baptist friends who won't drink, but every November or October, what is it? They're posting their Halloween party videos and all kind of stuff. And I'm going, that's the devil stuff. That's the devil's candy you people are eating. So I've got to learn on the issue of maybe alcohol, I'm a stronger brother. On the issue of Halloween, I guess I'm a weaker brother. Okay, because my conscience is just a little bit sensitive to that, even though I know my American friends probably aren't doing anything. They're not really getting involved in witchcraft or anything silly by going trick-or-treating with kids or anything like that. So I mean that's an example I give on some issues how I can be a stronger brother or a weaker brother. And I guess for different people, it will be different things depending on what context. In different countries, there will be different sort of social taboos and how Christians negotiate them.
Mike, I want to ask you a kind of more church related question for today that relates to Romans 14:15. So, here you have communities in Rome that have disagreements on the way they should live out their faith, and Paul is calling for patience and deference and unity. And sometimes people want to use that as an example today to say we should not split, we should not reject other Christians. But then you take something like Galatians, where you have others that Paul is very concerned with, basically saying, if you listen to them, you'll cut yourself off from Christ.
Grace, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I often hear the motto "better together" when denominations are struggling through a doctrinal or ethical issue, and I think they might appeal to Romans 14 and 15 to say, can't we all just get along? Aren't we better together? And yet that's not the only message we get from Scripture, where sometimes breaking away or splitting is necessary. Uh, how do you discern those things? I know it's a big question, but how do you discern those things? When to listen to Romans 14:15 and say,
Yeah.
let's just stick it out, and when to say, no, we need to cut ourselves off from each other.
Yeah, and this has been a big issue. It's been a big issue in the worldwide Anglican Church, largely precipitated by how different Anglican provinces have responded to the LGBT issue. So it's been a very big issue in Anglicanism. I know in America it's also been a very big issue in the United Methodist Church, which seemed to be in the process of going through some kind of de facto divorce of the denomination. And so when do you stick together, and when do you kind of hand over people to Satan, as Paul would say in 1 Corinthians? It is difficult. It takes discernment. most church splits are over things that are not really splittable. I mean, I've been to Scotland. There's about 6 different Presbyterian denominations in Scotland alone, and no one can really remember the real reasons for any of the splits anymore now anyway. And it's always a tragedy. You've got to remember it's a tragedy when the body of Christ is split, or it's divided, or set against itself. But there are times where, if the gospel is being, denied, if it's being mocked, if the holiness of the church is being tarnished, it's that there does come a point where you have to draw a line in the sand. Like I tend to believe that the church should be big, diverse, and inclusive, but we can only be as inclusive as the gospel. And where the gospel is denied, where the gospel is made light of or mocked, there you're not in a true and authentic church. So I tend to think, how does this church respond to the gospel? How does it think about the gospel? Is it referring to a gospel that just kind of attempts to solidify or prop up certain structures of a political culture? Like, is it just about white political culture in a conservative direction? Or is this just making the gospel a kind of a little bag that we dump in all of our progressive politics, or something like that? Or are we just, tethering ourselves to one particular charismatic leader, and anything he says seems to go, no matter how bad or unwholesome it is? So it is something which different communities I've been involved in have been discerning. You have to figure out within the precincts of your own conscience, what is the nature of your fellowship? What are the boundaries of that fellowship? And when is it tragic that you see a brother or sister seems to have parted ways, as it were, and gone to a point where you cannot follow them and cannot affirm them? It's always tragic. I like what Tom Wright says. Tom Wright says, look, unity without holiness is easy. Okay, unity without holiness is easy. Holiness without unity is also easy, I think you would say. But having unity together and holiness together, that is difficult. That is difficult. And the church in every age has to discern that. What is the core of its beliefs? What are the areas of conviction, the areas of conscience, where you can legitimately affirm people in their differences? And what are the boundaries? Like I said, when have people gone to a point that you cannot follow them and you cannot affirm them? Yeah, that's where I think we have to go.
Let's go back to first century Rome then, and I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this. So we get the sense that there were these house church communities that were culturally oriented, and so I'm imagining actual households or housefuls, as they sometimes say. Some of them are more Torah observant in certain practices, and some of them aren't. They seem to be worshiping separately in some ways, and you can imagine that happening in houses. But is there a way in which they're also worshiping together sometimes? So, for example, Paul's sending a letter, right? The letter, I mean, in our minds, we imagine they're sitting in an auditorium.
Yeah.
And the PA's on, and but as I'm thinking more and more about what's realistic, it's probably more realistic that it's circulating than there's some sort of big tent gathering.
Mm.
How would you imagine there being some kind of unification practically amongst these smaller communities? Do you imagine they're ever gathering together as a whole? Is that possible?
Maybe not in one big place. I mean, I tend to imagine you could have a group of anywhere between 6 to 15 people meeting in, a small apartment, or in a little shop, or some of the very various, meeting places. I mean, Eddie Adams has got a good book on Christian, worshiping places, or it could be a kind of a place that of, the triclinium of some wealthy patron of the church who's got a slightly bigger house. They could be meeting places like that. But it could be the size of like a teenager's bedroom, where you've got 12 or 13 people, listening to someone offer a prayer, sharing what food they have, someone gets up and maybe gives a prophecy, someone who can remember, parts of Isaiah will come and read that out, and then someone will talk about how this applies to Jesus or something like that. I mean, that's how I tend to imagine, going to church in the first century, if you like. How those churches interpenetrated each other, that is a good question. How much communication was there between the different groups? And we don't know for certain, but you can imagine that there was some, some mobility or some interpenetration of the groups, or at least some attempt to form relationships. And there may have been like, okay, well, we're in fellowship with, we'll accept people from that group, but we're not too sure about that group over there. But then other groups, oh no, we're kind of, we'll happy to kind of interact with both of them. Yeah, we don't know how permeable these various groups were. I mean, we don't know. We get a hint from Romans 16, the type of people who are in these churches, and you could probably say there are at least 5 or 6 different congregations in different parts of the city of various tiers and levels. I think, but Paul wants them to do. I mean, that's one of the big themes, particularly chapters 14 and 15. Welcome one another. I mean, he says that repeatedly. Welcome one another as the Messiah has welcomed you. So he certainly wants them to be far more unified and interpenetrating. I don't know whether he means by that, okay, rent out the Roman amphitheater and see if you can have a big kind of, Gentiles for Jesus sort of a day, and or anything like that. I think he imagines them continuing in their various worship settings. But if someone rocks up to your church from the other side of the Trastevere, you should accept them and accept them and include them Eucharistically in your celebration of the Lord's Supper or your communal meals or whatever you're doing.
Yeah, I want to change gears and talk a little bit about something that we're both interested, which is Paul's appeal to the Jesus tradition, to what the material behind the Gospels would be. Mike, you and I both know that Paul doesn't spend a lot of time quoting the very words of Jesus in his letters. And, this is kind of something that's troubled people because Paul quotes the Old Testament quite a lot. Explicit citations from what would become the Gospels is very minimal, maybe a handful of things. The Lord's Supper is an obvious one, but then there are a couple of other places. But there was a dissertation written in the 90s by our mutual friend, Michael B. Thompson, and it's called Clothe with Christ, and he basically explores Romans 12 through 15 and assesses to what level Paul was quoting from, unlikely, but alluding to or drawing pretty clearly from the Jesus tradition. And he finds some things there that give us a connection between Paul's teaching and the teachings of Jesus. There isn't a whole lot there. So what do you make of that? What do you make of the fact that Paul's not, and some people have minimized this, saying, oh, when he originally preached to them, he did all that. But then in his letters, he doesn't do it again. Yeah, but he would have also taught them the Old Testament, and he continues to quote the Old Testament. So I think it's kind of a false lead to say, oh, they already knew all the Jesus stuff. What do you make of the fact that, yes, in places like Romans 12 through 15, for example, some of the love teaching, Paul does seem to be looking back to the teaching of Jesus. But why don't we see more explicit quotations of the words of Jesus in the letters of Paul?
Yeah, that's a good question, and people have wondered that. And all the way through to, Paul basically did not know anything about the history. He was crucified. He didn't like divorce, and he believed in the love command. And something that's pretty much all Paul knew. I find that a little bit hard to believe because I think Paul was part of the Judean scene, and he, persecuted, possibly interviewed, interrogated, maybe even tortured members of the early church. So I certainly think he knew a lot of the backstory of the church and of the person they were venerating, Jesus of Nazareth. I do tend to think that the main reason he doesn't mention so much of Jesus's teaching is because he's dealing with stuff that largely is situational. It's based on the sort of context of the wider Greco-Roman world. I mean, I don't think Jesus taught too much about, well, I don't think he taught at all about, food sacrifice to idols, because, in Judea, this is not really a problem. Certainly not in Jerusalem, as far as we know. The other issue about, is the person who speaks in tongues more important than the person who prophesies? Again, that's not something you find in the Jesus tradition. Also, how do you integrate Jews and Gentiles together with or without circumcision? Again, you can see Jesus talking a lot about the preeminence of faith, believing in him, and how he's the harbinger of God's kingdom. He does accentuate faith, even as he himself, though, is fairly Torah observant, as far as I'm aware. So it kind of maybe sets up a problem that people like Paul and James and Peter would deal with later. So I just tend to think it's mainly because the situations don't often allow for a direct appeal to Jesus's teachings, but you like, as you point out, you do find some echoes, particularly in the love command that you get in chapter 14. You also get it in chapter 14, where he talks about, I'm convinced in the Lord that nothing itself is unclean. I mean, that might be a bit of a throwback to kind of Mark 7 or something along those lines. So that every now and again you get these odd echoes, and Michael Thompson's thesis, I think, does a pretty good job of mapping out those possible echoes of Jesus's teaching in Paul's own exhortation. But yeah, people are right to wonder, why don't we get more of Paul's preaching? I do think there's a good chance he did do a lot more of it in his sort of initial evangelism and destruction. And tell me what you think about this, Nijay. When Paul says, before your eyes, Christ was clearly portrayed as crucified. How can I put it? The dramaturge in me wonders, does Paul actually do kind of like a one-man passion play when he talks about the story? Because in the history of Western drama, during the Middle Ages, the passion plays were one of the main ways in which the theatre tradition was continued on. When people lost all their copies of the plays of Euripides and Sophocles, a lot of drama was based on scenes from particularly from the Gospels. That was a lot of troops of drama would do that. Now, I'm not saying Paul's doing the same thing, but the idea of doing like a one-man performance of part of the Easter story, or the story of Jesus. Now, I could be reading too much into this. I could be reading too much into, before your eyes, Christ was portrayed as crucified. That just might be a metaphorical way of talking about his preaching and instruction. But I do wonder if there's a little bit more drama and narrative in Paul's sort of initial evangelism and teaching. What do you think? Am I going too far with that, Nijay? Am I going too far?
It's definitely possible. I'm trying to think from the book of Acts, what kind of portrait do we get? I mean, he's going into the synagogues and he's reasoning with them about Jesus the Messiah. So, I don't think he couldn't be dramatic when he's sharing about the life of Jesus.
Yeah, but what about in the lecture hall of Tyrannus? In the lecture hall of Tyrannus in Ephesus for 3 years, Paul's Broadway show, The Life of Jesus, kind of like Alec Guinness doing the Gospel of Mark. Alec Guinness had Obi-Wan Kenobi. He did a one-man play of the Gospel of Mark. Did you know?
I mean, we can just imagine that he would have committed to memory as much as he could, given his vocation.
Yeah.
But I want to bring up another possibility, and I haven't really talked about this before. I just thought about it recently. But when Paul appeals to the Old Testament, he often says, as it has been written. So the kind of ancient graphic, meaning scribal nature of the Old Testament gave it this kind of long history and something that God had done over long ago that still has relevance, versus the ongoing development of oral tradition, which is not to say that people were making up the words of Jesus, but to say they're being circulated mostly by word of mouth. It carries a different tone. when you talk about what Jesus taught than pointing to a text and saying, as it was written.
Yeah.
I wonder if that
Paul,
has something
yeah.
to do with it,
Yeah,
that
Paul
this
does
would
things.
capture, yeah, that this would capture the readers in a different way. Christopher Stanley, I think, does stuff with this, but it kind of hits the reader in a different way to point to a writing versus talking about something that was still kind of being circulated verbally. I don't know if that might have something to do with it. That he's not going to point to this as authoritative, even though obviously it was for Christians. I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say, Mike, is did Jesus treat the words? Did Paul treat the words of Jesus at that time differently than the Old Testament? Even though now we obviously hold both as Holy Scripture.
I think in a way, though, he does. Like in 1 Corinthians 7, he gives a command from the Lord, and he says, look, as the Lord said, and he's then talking about, sort of, I think the divorce command, or the prohibition of divorce. But then he says, okay, on this other topic about where he's saying, okay, look, I don't have a teaching from the Lord, but as one who is in the Lord and is competent in these matters. So he is saying, look, the word of the Lord is authoritative. Now he says, no, I don't have a word for the Lord, but, I am authoritative too. I'm kind of cool. So I think he does treat them like that. And sometimes he can use certain he doesn't say, as it is written, but he can, the way he used paradidomi, he says, what I received, I think that received language kind of stands in place of the gegraptai, as it is written. So I think he does a little bit of that, but the instances are admittedly limited. Okay. Well, Nijay, there's one final passage I would like us to cover in Romans 12 to 15. This is one of my favorites, and that is Romans 15 to 16. Paul says, I have written you quite boldly on some points as if to remind you of them again because of the grace God gave me to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles with the priestly duty of proclaiming the gospel of God so that the Gentiles might become an offering acceptable to God, sanctified by the Holy Spirit. Not Paul, you're Nijay. Nijay, what is, you just look like Paul. Nijay, what is the priestly service of proclaiming the gospel? What is priestly about it? Here's a question. What is priestly about proclaiming the gospel?
Yeah, well, both in the Jewish world and in the Greco-Roman religious world, priests were mediators. They were special people, especially in the Jewish tradition. They were essentially appointed by God. And even though they were mortals, they had a unique role to play in being able to stand in the presence of God and bring something from the people. And then on the other end, representing God to bring something from God back to the people. And so Paul saw himself as this unique representative, a mediator, the Latin word vicar, right, is one who stands in the place, right? So that's actually pretty close to this conception of priesthood. But then the reason why priesthood comes to mind is they were responsible for making sure the sacrifices were appropriate for giving to God in terms of being unblemished and whole and holy and set apart and appropriate and in keeping with what God requires. And Paul metaphorically transfers that to bringing the Gentiles as an offering. And he sees his apostleship as a priestly responsibility to bring a blameless people to God. He does this in First Thessalonians. He says, may the Lord keep you blameless and holy and body, mind, and soul, and so forth. And so I think this is a kind of metaphorical framework he uses to conceive of his mission. And I think it's a sobering thing because it's going to be a strike against the priest if they accept a blemished offering and give it to God. And Paul feels the weight, the burden of that. Now you're a priest, Mike, so this is special to you, right?
Yes.
How do you relate to this passage?
Yeah, well, every year I have to deal with a student, usually from a certain low church free tradition, who says, well, you call yourself a priest. Well, my Bible says there's only one great high priest. There's only one mediator between God and man, and it's the man Christ Jesus. So you should stop calling yourself a priest. You can be a You can be a pastor or an elder, but that's just wrong, because you are not a mediator. And when the students say that to me, I have a standard line. I say, "What do you call someone who does engineering services?" And they say, "An engineer." "What do you call someone who does secretarial services?" And they say, "A secretary." And says, "Well, what do you call someone who does, cleaning services?" And they say, "A cleaner." I say, "Well, what do you call someone who has the priestly service of proclaiming the gospel?" And they go, "Oh,
A pastor.
yeah, anything but a priest." And they say, "But you're not literally a priest." And I say, "Well, dude, you're not literally a pastor. Are you out in a field with sheep?" And they go, "No." Epiphany on the starboard bow. Yeah, I am. I'm not in a temple, with a lamb, cutting the throat of a goat on an altar to God. So I'm not literally doing that. But what I am doing is taking my students, or the people in my congregation, or my youth group, or my Bible study group, and I am trying to edify them, see them grow in holiness, okay? Taking them from what they were, bringing them to the obedience of faith, helping them to grow in a life of faith and godliness, and presenting them to God as my offering to him, okay? That's what Paul says. I am taking, these Gentiles, these pork sandwich eating, idol worshiping, immoral, ignorant people. I'm going to sanctify them in Christ through the Spirit, bring them to the obedience of faith, which does not require the Torah. Bring them to an obedience of faith, have them cleansed, have them sanctified, and I am offering them to God on the altar of my apostolic service. That, I think, is one of the most wonderful images of how Paul conceived his ministry, as a type of metaphoric cultic worship. And I know you're all about the cultic worship, Nijay.
Well, before we end, I'll just say a quick embarrassing story that when I was younger, not that much younger, but still younger, I thought that any nation that had a prime minister, the minister was a clergyman. I didn't realize this was a political term. So I was like, oh, I didn't know that nation religious. I didn't know that nation was religious. So I came to realize sometimes we use these terms in ways that we don't always expect.
Okay, so like you thought the prime minister. Well, okay, that's funny. That's funny.
Like the
Okay.
Pontifex Maximus, right?
Yeah. I guess that's how it is. Yeah. Well, in Australia at the moment, our prime minister actually is a fairly devout Pentecostal, so people are kind of a little bit alarmed and fear mongering that we're living in a theocracy. And oh man, Australia has so many conspiracy theories about Hillsong. It is like, you guys have like Dominion voting machines. We have like Hillsong. Like Hillsong is secretly taking over the government, and it
We
is.
have Hillsong too, so we have your Hillsong,
Yeah, you have,
and
well, the one and only Hillsong, the one and only. But oh man, in Australia, it's weird. It's Anyway. I won't go into that too much. We'll talk about let's finish up with Romans 12 and 15. If there is one text you had to refer a student to from this section, what would it be, Nijay? I mean,
oh gosh,
something maybe good to preach on or good to teach on.
yeah, I would say Scott's book is the best thing I've read in recent years, reading Romans backwards, because he does make this really strong case that there's tons of stuff in here that you need to know in these chapters to understand Romans. So I would go to reading Romans backwards to get a strong understanding. Another thing I recommend is Kathy Grieb's book, The Story of Romans.
Yeah.
She kind of does this thing where she shows how this is ordered in such a way to climax with these chapters. For years, I used that as a textbook when I taught Romans through Revelation, and it's a great, like, 100-page read that pastors have really enjoyed.
Okay.
What about you, Mike?
Oh well, I mean, would tend to. I mean, the text in Romans I would go to would be chapter 15, verses 7 to 13. I tend to enjoy that. Yeah, I probably would make Scott's book, Reading Romans Backward, one of my first choices. But there was also a really good article though by Ross Wagner on this passage of Romans, which I found. So I'd probably refer to the meaning of some of this stuff about receive one another and the use of the Old Testament. So that's probably I would go to if someone, because I feel that kind of brings out some of the main themes of both this section and the wider letter, which is that Paul wants Jews and Gentile Christians to welcome one another and glorify God together. So yes. Well, anyway, I think we'll bring it to an end there, Nijay. The Lord bless you and keep you safe in the land of Portland and in this era of COVID, and hopefully you and all your friends and family are getting vaccinated. And who knows, maybe Lord willing, one day we'll get together at SBL or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Mike, did I read that your daughter wrote a theological article for first
She
published her
did.
first theological article? So
She did.
huzzah to your family for that. I
Yes.
mean, my kids are younger, but I can only hope that they can publish theology articles in the near future.
Yes, she did. She did. She wrote her first article in our denominational magazine, the Melbourne Anglican, about a religion and science conference or theology and science conference, and she wrote up a summary of one of the main speakers. So yeah, well, thank you very
Yeah.
much, Nijay. But take care, buddy, and we'll catch up again for another one of our monthly chats. We'll have to come up with another topic. If you do have a topic you'd like Nijay and I to discuss, leave a comment below, and we'll be very, very glad to consider whatever you suggest. Thanks a lot, and bye.
All right. Until next time.